It's my pleasure to introduce our raised bed gardening speaker today, Kevin Konitsny. Kevin's a 2020 graduate of the Sandoval Extension Master Gardener Program. Now, he may be a recent graduate, but he is anything but new to gardening. He's also an avid woodworker who's been making cabinets and toys and furniture for more than 50 years. So gardening is just another opportunity for him to be working with his hands. He retired after 34 years in the utility industry. And then Kevin followed in his wife's footsteps and joined our Master Gardener program. I was fortunate to serve as Kevin's mentor last year, and I have visited his raised bed garden, and it is truly a great sight. I have to say I'm a little bit jealous. He has done fabulous work with these raised beds, and it minimizes bending over in gardening. And boy, I really am jealous of that. Kevin, welcome. Really happy you're here. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Well, as Sam said, we're going to talk about raised bed gardening. I started my beds when we, about 5 years ago, I started working on that site. It took me almost full 5 years to develop my raised bed site. I've got 17 beds, but I had a lot of work to do to get there. So it can be quite a daunting task, but if you take it one step at a time, it makes it easy. Just don't try to kill yourself with it. So let's get started with the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, what are raised beds? Garden beds are any structures that get the vegetables or whatever you're growing up off the ground. It can mitigate a number of impediments to gardening, such as stooping, like Sam mentioned, and creeping of vegetation and other things. Next slide, please. Reasons for raised beds. There's a lot of reasons. So, poor soil conditions, ease of planting and harvesting, irregular terrain, creates a natural border and customizable for your space. And we'll go over these in more detail as we go further into the presentation. Next slide, please. Poor soil conditions. Now, caliche soil is what I have here at where I live. And it's a calcium carbonate, and they call it in some places calcrete. It is extremely hard, difficult, or impossible to work with. You can amend it all you want, but it'll take several years to make it even usable. There are some parts of the world where they mine it and use it to pave roads. That's how hard it is. Another issue you could have is rocky soil. And you see the pictures here on the right on the slide. That's caliche up at the top. And then you got the rocky soil is the next one. You can have small and large aggregate within the soil, and it may not be, you may not be able to sift it out and make it usable soil. You'll just have to deal with all those rocks. So you could use raised beds to get away from that. Tree roots, it's difficult to dig and grow plants where you have a lot of tree roots integrated in the soil. And you don't want to integrate, you don't want to disturb those tree roots because you can damage your trees and cause them harm. So you don't want to do that either. Next slide, please. Ease of planting and harvesting. If you have mobility challenges, or you're getting old like me and you don't want to do a lot of stooping and bending, raised beds are ideal for it. You can also design your raised bed garden for wheelchair access. And if you can make them wide enough so you can get in and out easily, make it easy to plant, make it easy to harvest, and it'll help with all of those issues. Irregular terrain also, as you can see in this picture I presented here. If you have slopes or a hilly site, the raised beds can help you alleviate some of that problems. It does two things. One is it keeps your crops in one place. The other is if you get a heavy rain, it doesn't wash everything away. It all kind of stays in your beds. So you don't have to deal with those issues. Next slide, please. It creates a natural border. You've got a natural way to have the flow of people going through your garden if you like to share your garden with people. Keeps pets and people out. You can customize it for your space. And there's a couple of photos there One is around the patio, the corner of the patio, which I thought was pretty clever. But this one on the right, on the bottom, looks like it's in a geodesic dome of some sort. And they've customized that bed, that raised bed, so they can get at it from all angles, which I thought was pretty clever. It seems very workable. And you can do that for any site you have. You can just customize it the way you want. Next slide, please. Now, there are different types of raised beds. You know, you have the traditional on-ground bed, which is what I have in my garden. And you know, you can make those to any size you want. You can also get them from big box stores. You can have the elevated kind where you actually work on them standing up. And you can use even flower pots. If you have access to flower pots or you want to build your raised beds in flower pots, why not? I mean, it's a raised bed and it'll prevent the stooping, and you can put it wherever you want. So that's that's all. Yes.
Kevin, we have a really interesting question for you here. Do you have any specific designs that you would suggest for wheelchair accessible raised beds?
Well, no, not really. But the things you would need to consider is how wide the wheelchair is, whether you want to have a turning radius in there so you can turn the wheelchair around and space them accordingly. You know, when I planned mine, I planned it so I could get my wheelbarrow through there easily between the rows. But, you know, a wheelchair to turn it around in there, you would probably need to go, I'm going to guess maybe 4 or 5 feet so you can actually turn it around within that row between the beds. But that's a good question. That's something you would need to investigate and see what the dimensions of a standard wheelchair or the wheelchair you have are. Okay, another thing about wheelchair is you might want to consider the height you will be at. So you can customize the height of your beds to accommodate your wheelchair so you're at the right height for planting and harvesting. Okay, next slide, please. Now, sources for raised beds. You can buy kits. You can get them from big box stores. They're available online. They come pre-cut, ready to assemble. They have all of the parts included. They're a set dimension, but they're not very customizable. Now, you can customize them if you want, but then you're wasting parts of the bed you've purchased. Like I said, you can use pots. They're available for big box stores and online. They're ready to go when you get them home. All you have to do is put some soil in them and plant your plants. Makes it a little easier. Some of the others you have are the do-it-yourself type. That's what I've got. I've customized mine for my site. Supplies that are required from building supply stores. Must determine the size and cut the parts you need. You need to acquire parts for assembly, and they can be built specifically for your site. Now, some of the building supply stores will actually cut the wood to length for you if you're building them out of wood. So you can also inquire about that. Some charge, some don't, but that comes in handy if you're building a number of beds. Next slide, please. Now, bed materials. If you're going to buy kits, they'll be made out of plastic, wood, or metal, or some combination of both. And you can get those, like I said, at the big box stores. Now, if you're using wood, you can use cedar, redwood, or fir. Cedar and redwood are a little more rot resistant, so you don't have to worry about that. Fir does tend to rot over time, so if you want to let it last longer, redwood or cedar. That tends to be a little more expensive than fir, but mine are all made out of western red cedar. So important note, use only untreated wood. No railroad ties, no pressure treated lumber. Those all have toxins in them. Another option is concrete block. You could customize anything you wanted with concrete block. If you look at the picture on the bottom left here, that's it looks like retaining wall block, and they've just kind of made it the design they wanted, and you can even go around corners and other things. The other one is your standard cement block that you build walls with. You know, they're typically 8 inches high, 16 inches long, and anywhere from 6 to 8 inches wide. So those are, that's another option. Next slide, please. You can also use straw bales. You lay them out in the format or the form you want, fill it with soil, and plant your plants within it. Brick, here's some brick then in the second photo here, which is pretty attractive. You can use stone, or you can use metal sheets. Question we've had about the metal sheets is, do they get hot? And I really don't know. I presume they probably would. So you'd have to adjust your watering schedule accordingly. Next slide, please. Now you have composites and recycled plastics. They tend to look like wood, so that's what's in this picture here on the left. Or you can use water troughs. You can get those at any of the feed stores. Problem is, over time they will rust out. This one on the bottom is kind of a fuzzy picture. Is galvanized. The one on the top, I don't know if it's galvanized or not, but they do, even if they're galvanized, they'll tend to rust out over time. So they're not, that's an option you can use if you so desire. Next slide, please. Now I put in a special note about recycled materials here. Recycled materials may be attractive, and you want to reuse rather than waste things and stuff. But you've got to be careful of some of the issues, like railroad ties and treated lumber have toxins that should be avoided in your garden. After all, you're going to be eating these crops, assuming you're growing vegetables, and you don't want those in your body. There are examples on the internet of showing tires for growing things. I know years ago there used to be a lot of them out there for growing potatoes. You'd have tires full of potatoes. You just keep piling up potatoes and filling it with topsoil as the plants grew. And at the end of the season, you knock it all over and you have potatoes. But there's a lot of toxins in tires, and there's a reason they are not put into landfills. And be careful when using reclaimed and recycled materials. Painted surfaces may contain lead. Lead paints were a big thing up until about 1970. So you could have lots of lead paint. You don't want that getting into your food supply. Concrete block and other porous woods may have other contaminants on them. You want to just reject any materials that you think look suspicious. If there's any doubt, don't use it. Next slide, please. Now, I've provided a cost comparison here between wood, concrete blocks, straw bales, metal paneling, wood troughs, and composites. This is a standard size 2 foot by 2 foot by 4 foot bed. So it'll be 2 feet high, 2 feet wide, 4 feet long. For wood, it's going to cost you about just over $100. Concrete block is going to be less than half of that. Straw bales are going to be a little bit less. Metal paneling is going to be a little over 50 bucks. Water troughs are going to run you about the same as wood, but you don't have to assemble them. And then composites are really, really expensive. They're about 350, about 3.5 times what wood would cost you for the same dimensions. Next slide, please. Now, these are my beds. I used 2x6 Western red cedar. The beds are 18 inches high, 24 inches long, with 4x4 cedar for legs. Those legs are sunk into the ground about 6 inches to give them some stability so they don't move. And that was mainly when I was putting soil in there and moving the dirt around on the outside of the bed and clearing out the paths and stuff. I wanted the bed where it was, and I wanted it to stay in one spot. I overlapped my joints. You can see in that first picture there. I overlap my joints on the end just for more stability. Kind of keeps everything lined up so they don't kind of come apart on you. And you don't have to worry about those issues. Next slide, please. Now, soil. Any soil used in the beds should have a good amount of organic matter, mainly compost, to give your plants good medium to grow. You probably, well, you'll need to bring it in to fill your beds. You can use soil from your site if you have it readily available, or you can go ahead and purchase it from a soil manufacturer or compost manufacturers. There's many of them out there on the internet. You can find them just all over the country. There's some here in New Mexico. There are different ideas on how to fill the beds. Some say to use branches and large pieces of wood as the filler on the bottom. Others may use cardboard, newspapers, and other materials that will break down over time. The caution with that is these things are going to break down over time and your bed is going to settle considerably, especially the paper, cardboard. Those things will compost pretty quickly. So your bed, you could lose a third to half of your bed height, and then you're going to have to put soil back on top of that, or compost on top of that the next year and the second year. So that's something you want to consider when you're filling these beds. Maybe you do it all at once with good soil and let it go. Next slide, please. Now, my soil failure, the compost I acquired the first year had very large amounts of wood chunks, rocks, and sand. It was almost like a topsoil, but it had lots of wood in it. So I used it as is. Well, I got tomatoes, peppers, eggplant to grow. My root vegetables did not like it at all. They didn't have enough soil in them. Beans and peas just struggled and never did produce anything. And they did not do well at all. The next year, I dug all that soil out and sifted it. I used the wood chunks and the rocks. I threw those on the paths in my beds in my garden to make them, as mulch. And I used the soil as the base for all of my beds. By then, I had all of my beds built. The lesson here is to sift your compost or topsoil to eliminate the big chunks. It can be returned to your own compost pile if you have one, or you can use it as mulch. A sifter with 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch hardware cloth is ideal for making a sifter. You can make it any size you want. You can make it, the one I have is 2 feet by 3 feet. So it works out pretty well. Next slide, please. Soil. When I finished sifting all that, my soil failure, I purchased 25 cubic yards of enhanced topsoil to finish off my beds. Every spring, I top off the beds with a little bit of compost because they settle down as that compost breaks down over the year. If you purchase soil, it is important to make sure you use a reliable supplier. You can call up your suppliers, and when you order it, and ask them if there are any herbicides, any pre-emergents in there. Ask them about the source of their materials to be comfortable with what you are getting. Now, there's two different kinds of soil. There's two different kinds of topsoil. There's a topsoil, which is usually a 50-50 mix of soil, mostly sand, and compost. That is by volume, not by weight. The compost weighs a lot less than the soil does. So it's 50-50 mix by volume. Enhanced topsoil is a 60-40 mix, 60% compost. So it has more compost in it and less soil. So it's a little bit healthier, a little bit easier to get your crops going in that in your first year. Next slide, please. Things to consider when building raised beds.
Okay,
Beds
Kevin.
Yes,
Kevin,
ma'am.
hang on a second. A question just came in. I think you might want to ask here or be asked here. Don't you also need regular dirt along with the topsoil to make sure your plants have a full complement of minerals and other foods?
Well, yeah, and most of the topsoils have that. I mentioned it had a lot of it is sand, but a lot of it is regular soil too. The regular topsoil mix of 50-50 is 50% soil, regular native soil, and 50% compost.
Also, someone has asked, can you name a few places to buy quality soil?
Well, the best way to do that is go on the internet and to go ahead and search on the internet for those, because there's a number of them in town. You can just search for compost or topsoil, bulk topsoil. There's a lot of places that provide that. Any other questions?
That seems to be it.
Okay, things to consider when building raised beds. Raised beds minimize vegetation creep. They keep weeds, grasses, and other vegetation to a minimum. Now, we don't have a whole lot of vegetation creep in New Mexico, but in other places of the country, they do, where it's much, where the environment is much less dry, where they have wet environment. Lining the bottom of your bed with a hardware cloth to thwart burrowing critters like gophers, squirrels, badgers, other things like that. Is a good idea if you have those kinds of creatures in your environment. I don't have them out here. My beds are not lined on the bottom. PVC pipe hoops are very useful. You can use those for any number of things. You can put shade cloth. You can put hang string and wires from them for your vining crops. You can do any number of things, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. It takes time to build any raised bed, so you should consider that when you're planning your garden. If you're going to do 1 or 2 beds, you can probably do it in a weekend. If you're going to do 17 like I did, it took a long time because I planned a lot. I made them big. I put in a lot of plumbing, so they all had water sources. I have beds that are 18 inches high and seems to be the optimal height for me and my wife, who can sit, do a little bit of gardening, harvest our crops if we have to. One of my, when I first laid out my garden, I had 2 beds already set, and I had to move those. And it took a lot of work because I had to dig out the soil that was in there to make them move. Then I had to haul them to a new location, and that was a challenge because I had lots of things going on in the garden at the time. And then I had to reset them. That took the better part of 2 days. But so if you make a mistake, it's not something you can't overcome. So next slide, please. Now here's hoops. Hoops are useful for attaching shade cloth, row cover, or plastic. These are attached with electric conduit clamps and deck screws. They go in about 3 inches into that wood. They're very, I've had a number of uses for them, and we can talk about that in the next slide, please. I've used them to hold row cover. I had birds attacking my peas one year, put row cover over my hoops in that bed, and it kept the thrashers out. They love to eat tender pea shoots, and they even dig up the peas out of the ground before they sprout. This year I had strawberries and raspberries were delivered early. I have 2 beds for those, and I planted them, and we had cold weather roll in. We had that cold weather in February. So I covered it with 6 mil plastic. I used hoops to cover with 6 mil plastic, and I have special clamps that hold those on. And then I put an incandescent light fixture in each one of those, under those hoops, on nights when it was expected to be a hard freeze, to keep the temperature in there, in that space up, and generated enough heat to keep them from freezing. This year I'm going to use hoops for shade cloth over my tomatoes, because when it gets hot and we get those real hot sunny days here, tomatoes don't like the heat and they'll quit producing. So I'm going to shade them to help them keep producing all summer long. Next slide, please. Irrigation. Now, if you planned and built your beds, how do you water them? Watering by hand takes a lot of time, and you have to drag a hose and all that. But, if you want to do that, you can do that. The other issue with watering by hand is if you take a vacation or go away for a few days, you got to employ somebody to do that for you. So if you have teenage kids you're leaving at home, that might work. Using manual valves can make it easier than hand watering, but it still requires your personal attention. So you need to turn the valves on and off. and make sure that they're watering. Employing automatic valves with the timer eliminates the manual process. Now that doesn't mean you get to ignore them entirely. You need to go out and check to make sure they're watering enough and at the right times. I have my 17 raised beds. Each one has a water supply on a timer. So I can water each bed specific for those crops and specific for its stage of growing. I accomplished that. I installed pipes to each bed, and it comes from a valve manifold that has all of the water supply in it. This allows me to set the appropriate time for each one. Next slide, please. And like I said, with hand watering, you're probably dragging a hose around the different beds. It's going to be exhausting, but it has minimal investment up front. Drip irrigation works well with manual or automatic valve system. It delivers water specifically where you want it to be. Soaker hoses are good for vegetables that require a lot of water, and it's similar to flood irrigation where you can just flood the whole bed. I use soaker hoses on potatoes, onions, asparagus, and I use drip system on pretty much everything else. Next slide, please. Here's how my beds are set up. The picture at the bottom there on the left, that's the stub out for my water supply. I hook my drip system or my soaker hose right to that stub out there and lay it out for whatever's in that bed. That picture there with the rain birds on there, that is that's where my timers are. I've got electric to my timers. And then you see the open valve box there with everything hooked up and all the valves. And then of course, the bottom one on the right is the valve cover with the cover on the place, or the valve box with the cover on it. It's kind of dirty, but it is, of course, outside. Next slide, please. Now, I use soaker hoses and drip irrigation, as I mentioned, depending on the requirements. If you look in this first picture here, that's my asparagus bed. I use soaker hoses there because asparagus takes a lot of water and drip just would not do it. This next bed I have is my my raspberry bed that I planted most of this year. I had some plants already in there that didn't, that survived last year. And that's on a drip system. That's on a hose that's got 6-inch, it's like drip tape almost, but it's a drip hose with holes in it every 6 inches. And the next bed is my garlic bed for this year. I'm having lots of luck with my garlic this year. I mean, it's coming up fantastic. And that's on a drip system with a drip hose on it, or a soaker hose on my drip system there. Next slide, please. Now, these are my completed beds. I had 14 of my beds are 12 feet long. They're anywhere from 3 to 6 feet wide. And you think 6 foot wide bed's pretty wide, but I put big crops in there. Like, my asparagus is in a 6 foot wide bed. Potatoes I grow are in a 6 foot wide bed. Onions, the ones that are 3 feet will be smaller things. The ones that are 4 feet, I'm going to plant tomatoes in. I have one that is 3 feet by 8 feet because that's what fit in that space I had. I've got what's in that bed it's a permanent bed for rhubarb. And then I have 2 5 by 7 foot beds. Those are my berries. One is strawberries, one is raspberries. And then along my garden wall, there's a wall along the cinder block wall around my pool area. And the garden is down below that. That bed along that wall is 1 to 3 feet wide. And it is 35 feet long, but it's kind of curved around that wall. Next slide, please. Now, pumpkins, watermelon, and other vining crops. This is a lesson I learned last year. Vegetables that are large and vining are not well suited for raised beds. They are hard to contain. They tend to overgrow the beds. I had pumpkins last year. They took over my garden path. You had to take a detour around the whole thing to get at anything. And it was kind of my main path that it was blocking, so you had to go all the way around. they were quite prolific. And my watermelons had the same issue. So this year I'm making large beds that will be 8 to 12 inches high and 16 feet square. The reason I'm not making them 18 inches high is because, well, they're pumpkins and they all ripen up at the same time. You know, when you get the first frost, you go out and harvest all your pumpkins. So you don't need to be have them in a 18-inch high raised bed. The same thing with my my watermelons. You know, you harvest 1 or 2 at a time. I have had success with cucumbers in raised beds since you can train them on trellises. So they work well in raised beds. The vines don't get to be, 12, 15 feet long. They get to be 3, 4, 6, 8 feet long, and you can train those on trellises. They also need regular attention since the fruit needs to be harvested frequently at regular intervals. Excuse me. My dog assists me in harvesting cucumbers. She takes them off the vine and we'll bring them onto the patio and eat them. So next slide, please. Tomatoes. I grew 23 tomato plants last year. I had a huge crop, especially of the paste type tomatoes, because I like to make my own spaghetti sauces and marinara sauces and soups. And so these turned out to be very nice for that. They were roasted and put in the freezer, and they make great additions to a super stew. I planted too intensively in the beds, so I put 8 plants in a 12-foot long bed. I thought that would be a good idea, but it turned out to be a lot harder to harvest than I expected. This year I will do fewer. I will do 6 in a bed at 2-foot intervals. I will just have more beds dedicated to tomatoes. Also, good vegetables to plant along the edge of the tomato beds are carrots and radishes. They do fine as companion plants. And they mature rather quickly. Radishes take just, under a month. So you can look for companion plants too. Next slide, please. Harvesting and sharing. Well, we have many visitors during the summer. We have friends, relatives, neighbors stop by, and often they want to go out and visit my garden, and I like to show it off. So I take them out there and show off my garden. I tend to plant a lot more than my wife and I can use. So then they seem very small. You got a lot of plants and you think, wow, these small plants aren't ever going to produce anything. Then you end up with these huge excesses of produce. Well, I share them with people. I enjoy letting the visitors harvest whatever they want out of my garden. I like showing it off, and I'm always thrilled to have people help themselves to my garden, and I really do enjoy sharing. Next slide, please. Flowers and shrub. My experience with raised beds is for growing vegetables, but flowers or small shrubs should also work just as well. If you're planting shrubs in a raised bed, be careful to fully understand what that shrub is going to look like in a couple of years. You don't want to plant something that's going to be way too big for that bed and potentially be top heavy or unsightly. It may provide a solution for a small yard such as a patio home, where you can plant some vegetables or perhaps plant some flowers and have some color and attract pollinators. Next slide, please. Now, it took me 3 years to build all my garden beds, so I relied on what I call my mantra. The mantra is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So when you've got an overwhelming situation or a big project ahead of you, just take it one bite at a time.